People thought these expressions were not just optional visual flourishes like they are for spoken language. They were actual parts of the morphology, syntax, and semantics of ASL. For example, in one speech, the mayor requested that people not leave garbage out for collection because the storm would cause it to spill and create an even bigger mess. When translating the word spill, Callis distinctly stuck out her tongue. This is called the TH mouth in ASL, and it functions as an adverbial marker for something being sloppily done. Another example is squinting the eyes and closing the lips tightly to add the adverb incrementally. Callis used this when the mayor said that the hurricane recovery would be very slow and gradual. Other linguistic moves can be made with the whole body. In one speech, the mayor was talking about the possible road closures due to the storm. As he said, the FDR may be open or closed. Callis leaned her body to the left for open and to the right for closed. Not only that, but if Bloomberg said something about something else being open or closed, like the airport, Callis returned to the same use of space to emphasize the distinction. And there are countless other examples, but this should be enough to give you a sense of how the whole body is used in sign language. Before moving on to phonetics, let me just say a few words about one of the big universals of language, generativity. Recall that syntactic recursion is the key to producing generativity. By embedding clauses, it's possible to create ever-expanding meanings. Sign does this just as well as spoken language. And what's interesting is that this recursive embedding becomes more and more common the more generations of signers there are. In 2001, Anne Sengas of Barnard College and Marie Coppola of the University of Connecticut published a paper describing the emergence of a new sign language in Nicaragua. In 1977, the first official school for the deaf was founded in Managua, the nation's capital. Deaf children came from all around the country with no formal sign language skills. In the oral tradition, initial attempts to educate the children focused on fingerspelling and lip reading, but those attempts were entirely unsuccessful. And here's the interesting thing. As the students were being officially taught the oral method in the classroom, something different was happening outside of the classroom. On buses and school grounds, the children started to create a rudimentary sign language all on their own. This was the start of what was later to become Nicaraguan Sign Language, or NSL. Sengas and Coppola describe how these early forms gradually became more and more complex as younger children entered the school and adopted it for themselves. By the third cohort, there was significant linguistic structure in the language that did not exist in the first two cohorts. And one of those structures was a formalized recursion. By the third cohort, the children were frequently embedding clauses into their sentences. This innovation gave NSL syntax the power of generativity. The emergence of NSL also raises important issues regarding the final component of language, the phonology of sign. Phonology in speech is determined by the physical configurations of the motor articulators, such as the lungs, throat, tongue, and lips. Phonology in sign is determined by the physical constraints of the hands, face, and body. Let's focus on the primary articulator, the hands. If we're going to talk about sign phonology, we must talk about the pioneering linguist William Stokoe. Stokoe was a hearing professor, bilingual in English and ASL, and he taught at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Gallaudet is the premier university in the United States for the education of the deaf and hard of hearing. In 1960, Stokoe published Sign Language Structure. The book was notable for three big things. First, it put an official name to the unique version of sign that was being used in America. It has been known as American Sign Language, or ASL, ever since. Second, Stokoe created a notation system for recording sign utterances in writing. Up to that point, no sign system had ever been reliably recorded on paper. These two things were made more significant by the third contribution. Stokoe's book was the first to empirically demonstrate that ASL was an actual language, just as rich in structure as any spoken language. One of Stokoe's main areas of focus was the phonology of sign. The phonology of spoken language concerns several parameters, such as shape of mouth, location of tongue, timing of vocal cord vibrations, and so on. Stokoe showed that ASL was composed of similar parameters, but all in the manual modality. The big three are shape, location, and motion of the hands. This means that for every sign, there are three things that systematically combine to produce a distinct meaning. Perhaps the best way to appreciate this is to consider minimal pairs in sign. Remember, in speech, a minimal pair is when every phonetic dimension of two words is identical except for one thing. Like in Japanese, shujin, husband, versus shujin, prisoner. They differ only in the length of the first vowel. Well, it's the same with sign. Let's do a few examples in ASL. Starting with hand shape, there are 18 different configurations used for most signs. And while holding location and motion constant, differences in shape can completely change the meaning of two words. Consider the two signs for school and impossible. Both signs involve putting your non-dominant hand outward with palm facing up. To sign school, you lower your flat dominant hand with palm facing down onto your base hand twice, like you're clapping. The sign for impossible is the same, except instead of a flat hand, your dominant hand is shaped in a Y formation, which is a fist with pinky and thumb sticking out. Moving on to location, the words for apple and onion are identical in hand shape and motion. A closed fist with your right index finger slightly bent outwards, and at the same time pivoting the hand back and forth. But the location differs. Apple is done right near the mouth, and onion is done a few inches higher near the eyes. For motion, there's a nice contrast between a sign we've already done, school, and the sign for paper. Recall that school is basically a double clap movement, but paper is more of a sliding motion on top of the hand across the bottom one. Since Stokoe's publication, there have been a few other phonetic parameters added, like palm orientation and signals with the face. Putting all these parameters together, I hope it's clear that far from the idiosyncrasy of pantomime, the components of sign are highly systematic and reliable from one person to the next. Oh, and here's an interesting side note showing just how influential Stokoe's analysis was. His book came out in the exact same year that Hackett published his famous paper on the original 13 universals of language. At the time, linguists did not consider sign to be a true language, so Hackett's universals narrowly focused on only speech. But after Stokoe's book changed how linguists thought, Hackett later revised his list to incorporate sign language too. The final pieces of evidence that have sealed sign as a real language come not from linguistics, but from the fields of developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Developmentally, the native acquisition of speech and sign is remarkably similar. Verbal babbling and babbling with the hands both occur around 6 months of age, and this is followed by non-sign pointing at about 9 months of age. These typically lead to one-word speech and sign at about 1 year, and by 18 to 24 months, signing and speaking children are stringing together two signs or words to form simple sentences. These simple sentences follow reliable word orders. Native signers and speakers make similar sorts of mistakes too. For example, you might have noticed that English-speaking children sometimes mix up their pronouns. So if a parent says to a toddler, "You blew the bubbles," a child might say, "Yes, you did." This mistake is caused by not knowing the rule that a pronoun shifts meaning depending on who says it. I means me, except for when it means you. Kind of confusing, right? Deaf children make the same mistake around the same age. On the surface, this is pretty surprising. In most sign languages, pointing to yourself is the actual sign for I, and pointing to someone else is the actual sign for you. Why would signing children mix that up? Well, the key is to appreciate that the linguistic nature of sign. They aren't just like regular gestures. They're actual symbols that have some arbitrary relationship to their reference. This distinction between regular gestures and signs can be seen very clearly when taking a look at the brain using cognitive neuroscience techniques. In one study using PET scans, Karen Emery and her team at San Diego State had native ASL signers and English speakers either pantomime or sign the meaning of objects. For example, suppose there was a picture of a hammer. The hearing group would pantomime the action of hammering. In contrast, the ASL signers would produce the sign for hammer. On the surface, these two actions look practically identical. If you didn't know ASL, you might think the sign was just a pantomime. Here's the interesting finding. When signers made the sign for hammering, there was a focalized activity in the left IFG, which is involved in language production. In contrast, the non-signers showed a more posterior activation in the left parietal and temporal regions, which reflects more spatial visual processing of the actions. And when signers were asked to pantomime the actions rather than sign them, their brain activations were a lot like hearing subjects. This suggests that when manual actions are used as language, they activate language areas more than when they're just regular old pantomimes. These studies fit well with what clinicians know from patients with brain damage. Signers can have aphasia. Just like hearing aphasics, signers with Broca's aphasia, they understand meaning, but they have difficulty producing phonological forms. And although the signing of Wernicke's aphasics appears fluent, they have great trouble understanding and producing meaning. What happens when you put both patients in an MRI scanner? You can see that each type of aphasia has a neural profile of damage that looks a lot like its spoken counterpart. Findings like this have helped debunk one of sign's biggest myths. Deaf signers and hearing speakers have totally different brains. No, in terms of neural mechanisms, language is language, pretty much regardless of modality. Let's connect this back to one of our big themes. Over evolution, the brain didn't adapt to language. Language adapted to the brain.